Hi, welcome to Courageous Journeys. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me for today's courageous conversation and question. Today's question comes from Lanny. And Lanny's question is a fairly simple question, but like many things that I talk about, there's not a real clear or easy answer to this question. But it is something that a lot of people, not just survivors, think about. And her question is basically, what is normal play for children? What is normal exploration for children? And she shared this question because she is actually concerned that what she experienced, what she did as a child, may be abuse. So I think there's a lot of people that can relate to this question because sexual play and exploration is normal for children. And so most people engage in it in some capacity or another. It's easy to question your experience. Were you abused? Were you an abuser? Was it normal? Was it wrong? Did I hurt somebody? All those are questions that a lot of people have. And so while it's not a very clear thing that I can answer, I think it's an important conversation to have. So some things that I think are important to have in mind, I guess, or to understand. First, as I said, sexual play, sexual exploration between children is normal. So what that ends up looking like, though, could kind of cross a line into something that is not normal and healthy. And that's where it's a very kind of difficult area. Somewhat gray, but not necessarily gray, but kind of a difficult area. So there's a few things. One really significant thing when it comes to this is the age difference between the children. Legally speaking, I think different states, probably different countries as well, have different kind of criteria, I suppose, on what constitutes abuse versus normal play in terms of age range. When I worked in rape crisis centers, it's been a long time ago now, I think there was a specific age range that we kind of looked at as a guideline, not black and white, but just kind of as a guideline. And honestly, I don't really remember what that is or was. But when you think about developmentally where children are at, there's a huge difference between a child who is 8 years old and a child who is 12 years old. Not much of a difference between a child who is 8 and 9 or maybe even 8 and 10, or 12 and 13 or 11 and 12. Not much of a difference in age there, but 8 to 12 is a pretty big age difference. 12 to 15 is a really big age difference. 5 to 8 is a pretty big age difference. Now, does that mean that if you were 8 and you had sexual exploration with a 5-year-old that you're an abuser? No, it doesn't have to mean that at all. Now, if you made a habit of that, that might potentially be a different story. I want to make it clear too that what I'm sharing here today are my thoughts about it, just generally, and also that my thoughts about this come from the experience that I've had in working with a lot of different survivors who have been sexually abused by an adult and also had some of these other experiences. Like the video that I released recently about, was it sexual abuse? This kind of is similar in a sense. If what you experienced as a child left you feeling uncomfortable, if it left you feeling scared or ashamed, whether it was technically abuse or not, isn't as important as the way that it left you feeling. Now, obviously, if you want to bring charges against somebody, go to the police, then it's going to make a little bit of a difference. And you can reach out and speak to somebody, like an advocate from a rape crisis center or something like that, that can help you kind of navigate that and help you understand more specifically what the legal aspects are. But in terms of impact, either as somebody who feels like something happened to you, but you've never called it abuse, but you know that it felt bad, or on the other side, if you're questioning things that you did and feel like, oh my God, have I abused somebody? So if you're on the other side of that and are wondering if you've abused somebody, this is harder, because even, let's say there was a few years age difference, your intention may not in any way whatsoever have been around trying to control somebody or use somebody or anything like that. What is important in that aspect to recognize is accepting the reality that I wonder if my bringing this to this person, my wanting to do this with this person, did that potentially leave them feeling uncomfortable? Did it make them did they feel like I was like forcing them or making them do something? That's harder. And so a couple of things around that. If that is the case, first of all, if you were very close in age, and assuming that there were, that you didn't say, no, I don't want to do this, and somebody made you do it anyway, or that something was painful and you were visibly not okay and not wanting to be in that situation, that's going to have a different type of experience. So if you are a person who as a child maybe was a bit older, or kind of brought the idea to somebody else, if it's possible, if you have a relationship with that person still, now obviously every situation is going to be different, so I'm not saying that this is something to do no matter what your circumstances, but check in with yourself, maybe talk to a therapist about this, your therapist about this, but maybe you could go to that person and say, hey, I just read something, I just listened to something, whatever it is that you want to say, and say, I know that when we were kids, this happened, and I just want you to know that I really hope that it didn't leave either of us feeling uncomfortable in any way. I think it's reasonable to be able to do that, but again, your specific circumstances are important to keep in mind. And so talking to somebody directly, a therapist, that you can kind of talk about your specific circumstances, I think would be helpful. Because the reality is that as children, especially if you've already been abused, our idea of what is normal or what is healthy is really skewed. It completely creates the circumstance that we don't really have a good sense as a child in particular of what is normal and what's not normal. And so one of the things that can happen often is children can become sexually reactive. And sometimes that can look like trying to encourage, coerce, sometimes even threaten another child to participate in something that's sexual in nature. There's argument even, as a child, do you have the capacity to actually abuse another child? That's a whole other conversation and argument potentially there. But again, in terms of impact, in terms of healing, what I think is really important, if you are the person that was maybe a little bit older or maybe brought this to somebody else, is if you have an opportunity and you've talked to your therapist about it, maybe having a conversation with that person and accepting the responsibility for being a participant in that thing, even if it was very mutual. What I don't want to happen is for any of you that are watching this to hold on to guilt or shame around something that you were trying to understand as a child. And again, I'm not talking about if you were 15 and somebody was 5. Like, that is clear. Under no circumstance would that be okay. Having said that, if you were the one who was 15, it also doesn't make you a horrible human being. Now, if you've gone on into your adult life and continued to do that, that's a whole different story. And if that has happened, if there was a significant age difference like that, please, please, please talk to your therapist about that, because there's just a lot of factors that are important for you to be able to talk through and understand. So kind of going back to somewhat similar in age, and you're the one that maybe initiated or something like that. If you hold on to guilt or shame, it will create a lot of difficulty for you in your life in a lot of insidious ways. If you also were abused as a child, which is often the case for people that will initiate with somebody that's maybe a few years younger than them or something, the shame that you will carry is going to be even more significant. And you may not experience it as shame, you may not identify it as shame, but it's going to be there. So it's really important to please talk to your therapist about that. Generally speaking, most people are not going to see that as abuse. Now, does that mean that the other child didn't experience it that way? No, it doesn't mean that. Does it mean that you're a horrible person because that person experienced it in a way that left them feeling scared and ashamed and confused or mistrusting or whatever? It's important to be able to recognize your role in that without taking on a lot of shame around it and being able to talk to somebody about it. But even no matter what your intention is, somebody else may experience it in a way that leaves them struggling. And to that person, the impact is going to be there. Doesn't mean that you're a horrible human being. Doesn't mean that the person, if you're the person who was impacted by it, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you, that you're affected by it. And again, if you have an abuse history, you're likely going to experience it a little differently than somebody else might. So what it really ultimately comes down to is, first of all, children can abuse other children. That's something that I hear a lot of people use as a way to deny or minimize their experience. They say, well, he or she was a kid too, so it's not really abuse. That isn't true. That absolutely isn't true, especially when there's a significant age difference, and developmentally what that age difference really means. Because a 10-year-old is going to be in a very different place developmentally than a 5-year-old. A 13-year-old is going to be in a very different place developmentally than a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old. And there's no black and white when it comes to this. There's no magic age that somebody gets to. There's no magic age range. So again, what I want the people who are watching this to take from this is that it's important to notice how you feel about the experience that you had, no matter which side you're on. How do you feel about that? Do you feel that somebody did something that really didn't feel good and you struggle with the impact that it's had on you? Then that, for you, was an abusive experience. And you deserve and need support in getting through that. If the person that did that is still in your life, it's even more important to be able to work through that. And maybe at some point you would even have a conversation with that person. I'm not saying you have to, but it sometimes can help. Because as I've pointed out, people on that other side are often feeling like, oh my God, have I hurt somebody? Have I abused another person? So sometimes if that person is still in your life, being able to have a conversation about it can sometimes be a really good thing. So if you've been affected in terms of feeling like somebody did something that you didn't like and it left you feeling badly, it's important to get support and help and heal that. If you're a person who feels like, oh my God, have I abused another person? It's important to get help around that too. And again, there's a big difference between being a 15-year-old who does something to a child that's not that much of an age difference, especially never doing it again once you've become an adult, and somebody who might do that at 10 years old, 15 years old, 25 years old, and continue. That's a very different thing, and that's a whole different thing. So I know that there's not, like I said, this isn't a black and white issue, and it's really complex, and there's a lot of factors that come into play. And the reality is that a 10-year-old can sometimes approach a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old or maybe even a 15-year-old and try to get them to engage in something. Does that make the 10-year-old less kind of responsible? Possibly. Again, this is a really complicated issue, especially if it's like a 15-year-old, because sometimes, and some might argue that a 15-year-old should be in a place developmentally where they would not. But even depending on your family unit, if it's 2 siblings, it may not be as clear cut as another family with a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old sibling. So again, what are you left with? What has whatever you experienced left you feeling? That's ultimately what matters. And then being able to take that, I do think that this is an area where talking with a therapist can be really, really helpful. Because there's so many different pieces that might be playing into how you feel about that. Especially if it has left you feeling that something was done to you that you didn't like. And then, of course, if you take responsibility for that, the person, Lani, that shared this, actually shared that somebody else kind of initiated, but yet she ended up kind of feeling responsible, which is, for anybody who's been abused, that happens, right? Even when it's an adult who does it, we still end up taking on responsibility for it, seeing it being somehow our fault. So I realized too that you might come away from watching this video and feel maybe even more uncertain. And obviously that's not my intention or my desire, but I do think that it is important to recognize just how complex and nuanced this thing really is when it comes to children. When I worked in rape crisis, we didn't work with abusers. And it was a process of trying to understand if we're working with a child who's been abused, but has also initiated or maybe done things to another child, what do we do? What do we do? And at that point, what we came to is that when a child does that, if they have an abuse history, it's often an aspect, it's a reactivity within that child as a result of their own experience. It doesn't take away from the potential impact on that other person. But I think it is important to recognize that you can look at somebody who is technically a child who maybe has hurt somebody else, that you can professionally look at that child as doing something that's not okay and still seeing that person as somebody who needs help and as a survivor, while at the same time saying, doesn't matter that this person was a child, this person feels violated, betrayed, hurt, whatever it might be. And honor that. So no matter which side you have found yourself on, because again, sexual exploration and play is normal. It's healthy for children. There's nothing wrong with it. It is a very natural thing to occur, which kind of complicates being a survivor as well, because there's just so many, like you don't understand your own body and you don't get the experience of naturally coming in to your own body and genitals and sexuality. So it's completely So it just makes it so much harder. So if you have questions, please feel free to share them in the comments. I'm happy to come back, and I know, like I said, I know that this isn't an easy conversation and there's no black and white, but I do think it's an important conversation to have. So please share your comments. And again, if you see yourself on either side of what I've shared today, please talk with somebody about that. It's really important, because either side, you're likely holding on to a lot of stuff around that. So thank you for joining me. If you have a question that you'd like me to answer, you can send to QandA@courageousjourneys.com. I will put that link in the description below. And you can also connect with me at courageousjourneys.com. I'll share that link as well. And if you're on Facebook, you can join our group for members of Courageous Warriors, and I will place that link in the comments below as well. So thank you for joining me. I will look forward to seeing you next time. Have a beautiful rest of your day.